lytter til Københavns Universitets seneste forsøg på at forklare verden. Sammen undersøger vi, hvad vi ved, hvad vi ikke ved, og hvad vi diskuterer endnu. Velkommen til Verden forsøgt forklaret.
I wanted to welcome everyone again, and thanks also to Meta for the really kind introduction. It's so cozy to be here. I don't know about you, but it's my first time in this library, and what a lovely way to be here for the first time, and thank you all for joining as well. I would like to first pour you some water, Tom. Yeah. Very important to stay hydrated. And I'd like to maybe introduce Tom a little bit more. Tom might hate this, but I'm going to do it anyway because he's worth it. Tom's a professor of paleogenomics. Maybe he'll tell us a little bit more about what that means. And he's also the director of the Center for Evolutionary Hologenomics. He's definitely going to tell us more about what that means. I'm going to make sure of that. I'm also very curious to know more. I know a little bit, but there's always more to know. And I thought maybe I'd share a little bit more about the context of the whole center that is Tom's, because it's really quite cool. I mean, I'm biased, I guess, because I personally find it very interesting, but I thought that could be maybe some helpful background for all of you to know a bit about too. And Tom, you're welcome to jump in and correct me if I get anything wrong. Please do that. So the center has a lot of different groups in it, and as far as I understand, most of them are really about studying different aspects of the interactions between microbes, microbiota, and their plants and animals who are their hosts, and focusing on different aspects of that, and also a lot of the implications of these interactions for a really diverse array of like parts of society. So things from, everything from medicine to nature conservation to agriculture and food systems. It's really quite broad, and hopefully we'll get to hear a bit about. We're planning to focus in particular on all of those different implications tonight, which I think is pretty exciting. And Tom's Center itself is also based at an even larger institute called the Globe Institute at KU, which I also find personally very exciting and admirable, because it's a really truly interdisciplinary institute where they're really trying to bring together natural sciences, medicine, and the humanities to study a whole range of phenomena in the universe across scales. So everything from like the origin of stars and planets all the way to the origin of life on Earth and to the origin of disease and pretty much everything in between. I find that really fascinating, and I thought I'd share that as well, because maybe that larger context of where Tom and his center is can also shed a bit of light on, I guess, like why you're doing some of the things you're doing and why you're doing them in the particular way that you're doing them. The first question is very simple. The first question is, your center is about hologenomics, as we've heard. Tell us about what that means, and maybe you can also tell us a bit about what makes hologenomics specifically different from genomics generally, and why does that difference matter? Let's start there.
Great. I mean, that's a great starting question, and because actually I once upon a time was a pure genomicist. There was no holo in it, right? And as many people probably remember from their schooling, we have DNA inside us. Our DNA forms our genes. Our genes are what we describe as the recipe books for life. So your body is built of proteins, and they're encoded by the genes. And so there is this idea that's been going for a long time now that if you can sequence the genome inside an organism, so your own genome, for example, and if you can understand the information there, you can understand how the body is built. It's kind of like if you have a manual for a Lego kit, you can understand how to build a Lego kit, right? And actually, once upon a time, it was very hard to generate genetic information. It was a very expensive process. For context, the human genome is 3 billion base pairs long. That's a very large amount of information. And in the old days, where you could only study it a bit by bit, it was what we would do is we'd study a tiny bit of the genome, get a tiny bit of information, and be stuck there. But about 20 years ago, there was a technological revolution where it became very cheap to sequence genomes, and so most biologists and many people in the medical field and so on thought, great, we can now take whatever we're interested in. We can take this animal or this plant or this sponge. We can sequence its genome. We can understand how it works. We've learnt everything. And therefore, evolutionary genomicists like myself who love evolution said we can use this information to understand how life works. So, for example, if as a biologist you're interested in a question like, I have a wolf, I have a dog. If I sit next to a wolf, it will bite my hand off. If I sit next to a dog, it will dribble on me. Why is that? The idea was you could sequence the genome of the dog and the wolf, look for the differences, and then understand what changes have happened to explain why the dog doesn't bite you. And we were happy. We were all happy. We'd solved everything. We'd get all the answers. Myself, many others published lots of papers saying, we have the answer for this. We know why a vulture can eat rotten meat and not die. We know what makes this plant grow here. All this stuff. Everyone happy. Now, the problem is that about 10 or so, 15 years ago, this revelation started to occur that inside our body, we have microbes. This has been known since about the late 1800s. Our gut is full of microbes. And we know these microbes, we've known for a long time, these microbes digest our food. You know, that's how we get nutrition out of food. We know that occasionally they make us sick, not a good thing. And we know we can use them for certain food-related things like fermentation that you work on, but that was all we were thinking about until about 10, 15 years ago when people realized that sometimes these microbes in the gut actually can affect organisms in different ways. And this was quite revealing. So, for example, some of the first studies just found things like if you have a very fat, obese mouse, and you actually switch its gut microbes, it will become a skinny mouse. And if you've got a skinny mouse and switch its gut microbes, it will become a fat mouse. If you've, for example, got a mouse which is very fearful, scared, and you switch its gut microbes, it can actually become very bold, right? And there was this weird observation that these gut microbes were doing these things, right? And the reason that we started to get interesting was because we thought, for example, we could understand why mice were fearful or bold based upon the genes in their genome, but suddenly there's a whole other explanation from the gut microbes. And this led us to start thinking, maybe we misunderstand everything, maybe we're missing stuff, right? And essentially, we suddenly realized that if we truly want to understand how life works, how animals work, yes, we need the genome, but we need these microbes, and we need to see how they work together, and then we can finally start to understand that, right? And this is actually this term hologenomics. It's not just genomics, but it's genomes of the whole, although spelt differently, right? And so, finally, to get to your question, sorry, Josh, what we actually do in the center then, we study how life works, from the context of the host and its microbes and how they have to work together. And in doing so, what can we understand about microbes shape their hosts? And in doing so, one starts to find all sorts of crazy things that excite biologists like me. But as I guess we'll talk about later, they also have things that may be irrelevant for humans and change how we think about ourselves.
Great. And also, because of that, I guess maybe also have implications for a lot of other fields, even outside of the natural sciences. I mean, I'm trained in the social sciences, actually, and so once we start to talk about humans and human behavior and politics and institutions, suddenly it becomes a really thoroughly interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary question, and maybe we'll get a bit into that as well. So your center is not just the Center for Hologenomics, but it's the Center for Evolutionary Hologenomics, and you mentioned briefly that you personally yourself have your background is in evolutionary biology and evolutionary genomics, and so I'm curious to hear more about why evolutionary hologenomics specifically. What's at stake for you in framing your practice of hologenomics in terms of evolution, and are there ways of doing hologenomics that aren't evolutionary? I think that might be a secondary kind of disciplinary question we could get into, which could help set up some of the implications we talk about.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and actually, the answer should be flipped. So when, as I mentioned, 10 or so years ago, people realized these gut microbes would have an effect on the body, actually, many of the observations were coming from medical stuff. So, for example, obesity is a medical trend, right? Certain microbes can make you obese or not. And people have started to link microbes to more and more chronic diseases today, right? So not infectious diseases, But everything from, as I said, obesity to mental health to, for example, arthritis, to some forms of cancers even, people are realizing these can be shaped by the gut microbes. And this is super interesting. If we think about, for example, just mental health, right? If there are certain microbes that can invoke a depressed state, that suggests that maybe by changing these microbes in the gut, one can reverse that or enhance it or so on, right? And that is actually what people are doing in the medical context, right? And that's great, but I'm not a medical person. I'm too miserable to like people. I like my animals and my plants. And what we've been trying to do is take the same kind of understandings that the microbes shape things and go back to questions that evolutionary biologists find interesting. I realize it's a kind of niche, nerdy industry. But there are questions that have been studied for a very long time in biology, questions of how do things happen. And as I said at the beginning, we think we answered it through regular genetics, but it turns out what we think is we didn't. And if I can again give one example that really fascinates me. So dogs are a system I like. Everyone likes dogs. They're good to talk about. As I mentioned already, wolves are not the greatest thing to have living with you. Dogs are, right? And if you talk to an evolutionary biologist about how do we take a wolf and turn it into a dog, the answer is we had some ancestors that somehow lived alongside wolves. The wolves had puppies. Every generation, we basically picked the puppies that were least likely to bite us or more friendly. We would breed them, and through time, through artificial selection, you get more and more tame behaviors, right? And as a result of this selection, it is true that today the wolf genetically is different to the dog genetically, and there are a catalog of genes that separate them that explain why a dog is calm and so on. And that's great. Everyone was happy that that was the answer. We domesticated a wolf by changing its genome, right? Now, the problem with this is that you change things that way very slowly. It takes many, many, many generations to successfully take a wolf and change its genome at all the positions you need to change into a dog, right? You have to make many, many changes by breeding and breeding and breeding. And that's fine, unless you're a cave person in the past trying to live alongside the wolves doing this, right? Because you can't spend 20, 30, 40 generations with wolves, slowly tweaking them and hope they don't eat your baby or bite you or so on, right? So that leads us to think, how then could we do it? How can we explain this phenomena that somehow our ancestors changed the behavior, but it takes a long time and they don't have time? And this is where the microbes get interesting, because I already mentioned that gut microbes can affect the brain. There is something called the gut-brain axis. And so we started thinking, I wonder if the way we changed the behavior was actually by changing the gut microbes of these things and somehow essentially drugging the wolf and changing its behavior, which meant that we then had a drugged wolf we could live alongside. It was too busy being stoned or whatever to actually to bite the person or so on. And so it's just the invoking of the microbes in the context to do that. Now, of course, a very good question is, why on earth would microbes in your gut ever affect your brain, right? Why would they make you obese? Obese is kind of intuitively obvious about, because if you are taking in food and you've got certain microbes that are very efficient of getting sugar out of the food, liberating it, that's more sugar going into your body, maybe you put on more weight, right? But how do we explain microbes affecting the brain, for example? This seems to be crazy, gut microbes, right? Well, the simple way of looking at it is what are these microbes actually, right? Microbes are specialists in taking in chemicals, converting them, and pumping out chemicals, right? If you buy medication from a pharmacy, many of them are produced by microbes in factories. Factories have these big fermenters full of microbes. Something is put in, the microbes convert them, pump out a chemical, turn into a pill, you eat it. Well, basically, the microbes in your gut are exactly the same. The microbes in your gut are sitting there. You take in food or drink. They convert that into new chemicals. And if any of these chemicals have got an effect, like a medicine, they will affect the body, right? So it's actually just moving a drug factory into your gut. And so going back to the behavior, what we think is that these gut microbes are taking in certain foodstuffs, modifying it into basically drugs that affect the brain, and therefore change the behavior, and therefore explain why people would be depressed or not depressed, or why the wolf is drugged, or so on. So it's about, can we explain these problems in evolution that we can't quite understand through the microbe as a helper?
Great. So our dogs are, you're saying, basically just wolves that have been drugged for a really long time, or?
Dogs initially were wolves that were drugged. Later through time, things changed, right? But and it sounds crazy, to be honest, right? But the funny thing is, you can actually test this, right? And there's evidence for this. As I mentioned already, there are mice and rats that you can make psycho-killer rats or chilled-out rats by simply changing the gut microbes, right? You can do this in many different, actually, groups of animals. If you take, for example, aggressive dogs and calm dogs, like feral packs of dogs and calm dogs, they have different gut microbes that are probably producing certain chemicals that are probably changing the behavior, right? And even in the domestication one, there is certain researchers in the past have actually tried to re-domesticate animals. There's a very famous experiment called the Belyaev fox experiment, where in the 1950s, a chap called Belyaev took foxes. They were actually farm foxes, normally turned into coats and stuff. He then tried to make new foxes that were like tame and new foxes that were like super, super angry. It worked. You can actually find these things. You used to be able to buy them until it's now not possible, I think, to get them anymore from Russia. But what he found was by selecting on them that he could change how they look, how they behave, and so on. But it was very controlled. And if you go and look at the microbes living inside them, you see that their microbes differ, right? You see there seems to be a correlation between the microbes and the behavior, which would be completely consistent with what we're saying. So there is evidence for this, that the behavior can be shaped. And ultimately, we and others are very interested in what are the range of behaviors and other features that are shaped by these microbes. How does that explain evolution? But I guess coming back to what you talked about at the beginning is, how could that also be relevant to humans? And that's where one starts speculating and really upsetting people.
Maybe that's actually a perfect moment for us to start speculating a bit more. And I hope not upsetting people, but if you're upset, then maybe that's to be expected.
They will be.
Is that what you're suggesting?
When we get onto rye bread, they'll be very upset.
Okay, good. Well, we're definitely going to come to rye bread. I think a lot of the stories that you're telling and suggesting, which are very tantalizing, at least one way that I'm hearing them, is like different stories about how maybe we as humans are so much more interdependent with so many other species than we maybe historically have typically thought, at least in sort of Western cultures. Both within ourselves, well, we could say both outside ourselves ecologically, right? But also, as you're suggesting, even within ourselves, such that what it even means to be human maybe needs to change or is changing as a result of some of the revelations coming out of the kind of research that you and your colleagues are doing in hologenomics. And so maybe if we start from that place of, how does our own understanding of ourselves as a species and our own understanding of our place in the larger world start to change through this science? Maybe that's at least that's one way into starting to think about some of the larger implications that this research could have. And I think that's where I'd like to turn to next, now that hopefully we all have a bit more of an understanding of the kind of science that you do in your field and the kinds of questions that you're seeking to ask. And I mean, as we've been talking about before in preparation for today, there are many different kinds of implications here, right? Both many different kinds and also many different scales, we could say. So, some of these implications of hologenomics are very clear for us as individuals, how we as individuals understand, what's going on inside our body, our relationship between our mind and our gut and our skin microbiome and all of that. That's one level, let's say. Another level might be in our relationships, in our interpersonal relationships. If that's true for us as individuals, then we could imagine that once you and I start relating, or once we start to relate with other people, whether it's in romantic relationships or family relationships or even work relationships, any kind of relationships, I guess those sort of interdependencies start to just like exponentially pile on each other, right? That's maybe a second scale we could think about. A third one might be sort of institutional. So when we start to think about what happens when we start putting lots of people in, when lots of people start to come together in institutions, in groups like schools, universities, prisons, I know you've been thinking about, Parliament, certainly, also. I think that's when things start to get even more complex, right? And then maybe the highest scale would be something like a whole society where you have lots of different institutions working together. let's try to, I think it would be fun to explore some of the implications across these different scales. And rather than trying to kind of partition them out, I think what we're also maybe learning from the story that you're telling us is that that also maybe isn't possible. And these implications maybe need to be traced back and forth between these very kind of sort of day-to-day, individual, personal stories and these very high-level, sort of societal-level stories and everything in between. It's a very long way of framing the question, but the short answer, the short version of the question is, let's talk about implications. Where would you like to start, Tom?
I think we should start at the basic, because I think one thing that starts to get people's minds turning is the idea that you're not alone, right? The first really important thing is, as you said, we've always thought of ourselves as, I am me, this particular unit, I control myself, my brain is my own, under my own free will or so on. And the whole point of these observations that the microbes are so integral into the life of the organism is that you're not alone. You can't function without the microbes, and it's not just you can't eat without the microbes, they affect you in so many ways. And this is really very interesting, because if I give you some examples of things that microbes do to their hosts, one can then see how this gets a bit worrying when you think about it. So I've already mentioned they can affect your brain, they can affect your nervous system, they can essentially affect whether you're feeling nervous or feeling bold, and this is proven in animal models where it's a very easy control system, right? So that's very interesting, they can do that. They can, for example, affect things like activity levels in animals. You can have an animal which is very, very, very active, or an animal that's very, very, very slow and laid back because of the gut microbes. My absolute favorite is that in certain animals, they've shown that partner choice is driven by the gut microbes. So, for example, in flies and in some rodents, you will have a male fly and some female flies, and the female fly that the male fly picks is completely driven by which microbes are living inside the gut of the fly. And so, that seems to be this crazy drawing thing, and it's probably because they produce certain chemicals that they react to. And initially, though, this was seen in flies, which are these dumb things that fly around and don't do much, is then being seen in rodents. That rodent partner choice is being driven by that. And the fun thing about all these is, as you mentioned, you can start to think about, what does this mean about our life? So one of the terms I learned when I moved to Denmark 18 years ago was the A versus B type person. For some reason, the rest of the world doesn't talk about this. But we have people that like to get up early, the A types, and people that like to stay up late, the B types.
What type are you, Tom?
I am very much an A type. It's lucky I'm still awake right now. But the funny thing is, if you've got an A and a B type, what causes this, right? Now, people have looked for a regular genetic explanation of this. Is there a gene that explains if people are A or B type? And other people have said it's cultural. If you just happen to be born in Spain where dinner's at midnight or whatever time, maybe you're a B type, right? But now I wonder if it's the microbes doing that, right? Could you have certain microbes that actually get into their own rhythm inside you that are just pumping out chemicals at certain times of day and waking you up early, right? And how is that being affected by your diet? Could you change an A-type person into a B-type? Or even better, could you help all the poor students who have to get an 8 a.m. lectures but they're a B-type by changing their gut microbes, right? So that's one interesting one. The whole how much does it affect your brain is super, super interesting, not just for treatment purposes, but one can start having all sorts of interesting thoughts about this. Should we talk about that now or later? Now?
Whenever you like.
Okay, well, so there is very, very clear in animals that, as I said, you can get heightened aggression or heightened relaxation by changing gut microbes, right? And while it's interesting to speculate about this in the context of dogs and wolves and everything, I like to speculate it in other areas which are very much on the bounds of what's ethical or not when you think about it. But for example, if it's true that microbes can make you calm, would it be ethical to, for example, in places where you want people to be calm, change their gut microbes to make them calm? Prisons. This is why you mentioned prisons, right? Wouldn't it be nice if in prisons people were like chilled out and calm? Could we do that by changing their gut microbes? Now, first question, how would you change their gut microbes? There are two ways. You could, of course, give them pills, but giving medicine in prisons is not allowed anymore, probably for a good reason. But actually, one of the big drivers of gut microbes is what you eat and the environment, right? So actually, you can change your gut microbe by eating certain foods. It's well known that if you eat fiber-rich foods, you can change the gut microbes in a certain way that they produce what are called short-chain fatty acids, which generally induce a calm state in the body, right? So would it be interesting to start increasing the fiber content in prison food to change the microbes of the people in the prisons, to change the production of short-chain fatty acids, to just make them calmer in general, right? And would that be ethical? Because to be honest, if I was just saying we're going to change the diet of the people, maybe that's fine. But if we're changing the diet to change the microbes to produce chemicals, is that any different to drugging, right? And I think this is an interesting question because I work at the Commun Hospital, where we have a canteen, which, as far as I can tell, every day now is vegetarian, which is going to be giving me more fiber, which is going to be changing my microbes, that's going to be drugging me. I'm quite happy with that, right? But one gets this interesting...
Because you're drugged, Tom.
Well, that's because I'm drugged, right? So you could start having these interesting thoughts, right? You know, where could you use this? And we can come back to some more examples about that. I guess very briefly we should talk about the other one, which is mate choice, right? Because, I mean, most people believe they had free will in picking their partners, right? I mean, we're smart humans, we've got our brain and so on. And now the question is, how much free will did you really have? And were your microbes involved at all? Now, just to be 100% clear here, because I always upset people with this, what I'm not saying is that your microbes made all the decision. Right. But did the microbes get involved in the process? Did they somehow condition the process, right? Did they set you towards some kind of path which, yes, your brain and your thoughts and all these things got involved in, right? And given that we see it happening in animals, can we rule out that's not the case? And again, I mean, just to give a very perhaps silly example, often you will find vegans living together in a partnership, which is shared ethical beliefs, right? It's very convenient and all this kind of stuff. But could it also be because by eating the same food, they have certain microbes that are producing certain cues which are basically attractive to each other, right? Because that's basically what we're seeing in rat. At which point has it gone from pure, my ethics and my belief in this through to, these microbes are playing a role in it, right? And there's actually a very funny follow-up to this that I heard, which is funny as in interesting. I heard a talk by a man who told me that humans produce various kinds of pheromones, right, sex hormones, right? And there was a very famous experiment in the 90s called the Wedekind experiment, where, for those that haven't heard about it, what happened was men volunteers were given T-shirts, and they were told to be very active, and they made very sweaty T-shirts, right? And then afterwards, women were blindly asked to sniff the T-shirts and rate them on how awesome did the T-shirt smell, how attractive was the smell, right? And Wedekind used this to actually show that different people react to different kind of pheromones produced by men differently, right? And this, he argues, has got all sorts to do with like how we pair up and so on. And it's definitely known that, yes, humans can respond to these pheromones, right? Now, the funny thing is, what I was told was that actually, although we produce pheromones, they have zero effect until bacteria that live on your skin under your arms chop up those pheromones, convert them into a second product, and it's that which is giving the response, right? It's kind of why if you do sport in a T-shirt, get all sweaty, actually it doesn't smell too bad at first, but you leave it a few days, it smells bad, because the bacteria are chopping it up and changing it, right? So anyway, if what I was told is correct, what it means is that the bacteria under your arms are acting on the pheromones to create something which is what is actually instilling the response in the person smelling it, right? And so if you believe that attraction is driven by these, it's actually the bacteria causing the effect. And why this gets funny to think about is because today, most of us shower and wear deodorant. And what that's very good at doing is killing the bacteria under the arms. So possibly this is a mechanism which 50, 100 years ago was super important in mate choice, right? Because probably back then the bacteria were busy because they were there chopping it up. And maybe today it's been lost because we're too clean, right? And so if that is true, you can start thinking how? Well, maybe that means that we are maybe using our brain more for picking partners, and maybe 50 years ago it was this animal magnetism essentially, right? It's very fascinating to think about this and leveraging on it. And could you change who finds you attractive by putting different bacteria under your armpits? And would that be ethical?
I have so many things I want to follow up on. So firstly, this is maybe more of a empirical scientific question. When you're talking about the importance of the microbes chopping up the pheromones to actually produce the molecules that we smell, do you know if there's any work on like different microbes chopping up the same pheromones differently to produce different smells, such that it's not just that that's their functional role, but actually the specific composition of our microbiome would be producing different smells from the same compounds. Is that the case?
I absolutely don't know, but I would expect that's the case because that's what microbes specialize in doing, right? Which then is also interesting. You could change how attractive you are to different people by changing the microbes. You can't change your pheromones, but you could change how you process them, right? So I would not be surprised.
I wanted to pick up also on one of the things you mentioned when you were talking about the potential applications which would probably be ethically fraught in somewhere like prisons, let's say, and maybe we can be clear that we're not necessarily advocating for any of these things that we're talking about tonight.
We're advocating somebody braver than us look at it.
At least to study, let's say, but maybe not necessarily to like implement, without sufficient ethical reflection. But they're clearly important questions to raise, because if they're not raised, then probably they'll just be done without asking questions first. I think that's maybe our intention tonight. It strikes me that maybe we need a moral philosopher here on the stage to engage with that question, because I think what you're putting your finger on, what you're getting at, sounds to me like that what maybe matters is the intention that one has in doing a certain thing and not necessarily doing the thing itself, right? So let's talk about changing diets. And this is something that I and my group are working on a lot these days around sustainability. So, today with lots of concerns around sustainability, there's a lot of talk around how, all of us maybe need to be shifting towards like more plant-based diets. That clearly would have some kind of hologenomic microbiome effect, as you're describing. If that's the intention of changing institutional eating patterns and diets, then probably there would be a lot of consensus that would be very virtuous and good. And maybe, as you say, there would be a knock-on effect of it also changing, people's microbiomes and maybe even their behavior. So I guess, I don't know if there's an answer to this question, but maybe the question is something like, if you were to, somehow cynically we could say, like, if you were to only frame it that way, maybe you could get a lot of political traction for the exact same intervention, which if you were to frame in a different way about, say, modifying, immoral prisoners' behavior, or whatever, I put the immoral in quotes, that maybe you'd get a very different political response. I'm curious what you think about framing it that way.
Yeah, well, I think you would get a different response, but the point is you're still changing something that people might not want changed, right? So although we think it's a good thing that we can make people calmer, maybe the people don't want to be made calmer, right? And again, the problem is that where do we draw the line, right? But I actually do think that it is worth discussing, because the funny thing about this is that if in many countries now, there have been people arguing that we need to change diets, right? And in schools, so I'm British, as you can tell, British schools give you school lunch, and it is about as bad a lunch as you can get, right? It's the cheapest material that's fed to people. It's like, chips. We love chips in England, and processed sausages, and no fiber and so on, right? And of course, the more deprived the district the school is in, the worse the food is generally, because they've got no money to do stuff. But kids get free food, right? Now, people like Jamie Oliver, the TV chef, have been arguing for God knows how many years now, we need to improve the quality of the foods in the schools, and it needs to be fruit-rich and vegetable-rich and fiber, all good. But of course, people say, well, that's great, Jamie, but who's going to pay for it? Now, the reason this gets interesting to think about, though, let's now go back to the idea that fibrous food, if that changes the gut microbes of the kids and actually produces these short-chain fatty acids and maybe induces a calm state in the kids, right, gives them more focus, how many knock-on effects does that have outside of the school, right? Do you suddenly find you can save money on social workers, right, or policing or after-school clubs, because the kids are just in a more calm state to start with, right? So maybe these things that Jamie's been saying are actually cost positive if one was to do it, right? So maybe there is actually an economic argument to start doing it. Now, that doesn't mean we've got over the ethical challenge of essentially we're drugging the kids. Unless we say maybe the problem is we're drugging them now badly. We're giving them the crappy food and they're being drugged, right? So at least one can think about these, that it's, and again, what we've often thought is that this push for healthy organic food is a yuppie, rich person, Denmark kind of thing that can happen and the rest of the world can't do it. But if you start looking at the numbers, which I'm no good at, maybe you'll see that these things are worth doing, right? And maybe if you, maybe the fact that companies are bringing in more and more vegetarian food is actually helping their productivity, right? Because the people are just in a calmer state, they can deal with work better. It's just, I think, the thing that's worth looking at, right? And One can then, of course, talk about what is the right thing to give people, and there's a whole lot of interesting research that can be done there. Where does the role of things that you work on come in there, like ferments? Why is it important to eat fermented food and so on? But at least I think it's a conversation people should start having and realizing that there's more to just giving people healthy food than they get vitamins, right? And see what happens.
Yeah. One thing I'm getting, I think, that maybe is a theme that's running through everything you're sharing with us tonight is something like, what's the right way to say this? Something like, I feel like it goes back to these really deep ideas about like how we understand where our own boundaries are in some way, like physically in the world. You know, I mean, when you were talking before about, you know, there's me and my microbes, even the way that we're talking about them is still somehow revealing that it's really hard to get away from the sense that there's an I that exists that's prior or separate from my microbes. But I think all the science that you're doing is actually showing or suggesting that maybe that's even not quite right. Like maybe the I, the extent to which we experience that we have an I, that we have a person, that the microbes are actually already part of that experience. And I wanted to raise this or offer this because I feel like this relates very strongly. This sounds like up here and very philosophical, which maybe it is, but it also is actually very practical and has a lot of applied implications. So if we link it to what you're talking about now around, say, diet and how we would understand like the difference between offering food versus drugging someone, let's say. If we understand this situation from that perspective, from the perspective of, well, the microbes are already there all the time, they're part of what make up our experience of being an I in the world, then it kind of doesn't make sense to make that distinction, actually. Seen from that perspective, it seems to me like it makes a lot more sense to see things as like, anytime we're interacting with the world every day, whether it's through eating or showering or the clothes we wear or whatever, we're always having these kind of chemical encounters, let's say. And so the question is not like, is an encounter shaping us or not? I feel like that's the sort of the implicit question in the is it food or is it a drug question. Maybe the question is more like, how are all of those encounters that are happening all the time shaping us in different ways? It becomes more of like a qualitative question, maybe. And that feels very important because if we frame it that way, then, say, the morality of asking like, oh, is it ethical to, you know, do this because you're going to drug someone or not? Then the question actually ceases to make sense. And then it actually directs us towards a very different kind of ethics, which maybe we need a whole other evening to start to unpack. But at least that's one thing that I'm hearing from a lot of the stories that you're telling. And now we have some time. If we, you know, I personally would love to hear from any and all of you. If you have any things that you found particularly interesting, things you'd like to hear more about, we have some time for questions, comments, feedback.
So you're saying that if we change the food, we can also maybe change how we react, and maybe people with ADHD, all the numbers that letters that we have. What kind of food would you recommend that a person should eat to change, maybe, or be more calm or whatever to control that kind of stage they have mentally?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question because it gets into something I avoided completely, which is the complexity of the system, right? At face value, there are certain things which are good to have inside you, and these short-chain fatty acids which come from fiber should basically generally make you calmer, right? And just to be completely clear, when I say they make you calmer, you can imagine it, if you have a natural state of excitation, it will lower that, right? But it won't mean you can't get super angry or can't get distracted, right? One of the very important take-homes of this evening was that Hitler was a vegetarian, okay? So in theory, he was eating lots of fiber, but it didn't stop him being a nut job, right? But generally, one would imagine that, yes, fiber-rich food is very good because it is well known to induce calming. And the calmer you are, the easier it is to focus. Now, it might not cure your ADHD, but it might lower the level of excitation, right? How much more you can push it, this is completely unknown, right? But I think one of the really interesting things is that because we know microbes can produce so many chemicals, if people start looking at what are the drugs that help with ADHD, are there natural analogs that can be produced by bacteria, right, if you combine them with certain foods? And this is basically an area that's not looked at. But our point is that I think there are areas that could be looked at. You could start doing that. So, but anyway, fiber. give kids as much fiber as you can. That will help solve things.
Rye bread.
Rye bread.
That's maybe if you allow me to jump in actually on this. I'm really glad you asked this question and that you brought in complexity to the answer, because that's yeah, as you said, not something that we actually dwelt a lot on in the first part of the evening in the conversation. But I think all of the stories that Tom shared, all of the examples that we discussed, as Tom was saying, I think I can really try to throw in my 2 cents and emphasize that feels very important to frame it that way. It's not, at least one way that I maybe think about it, you can tell me if this sounds right to you, is like, it's not necessarily that microbes determine things. It's maybe more that they are one of multiple factors shaping these phenomena. And that feels like a very important distinction to make, because also for ethical reasons, as we talked about, if we start to go down the path of thinking of it as a kind of determinism, then that leads us into some potentially very dark and also untrue and inaccurate places. But if we think about it in terms of it's one of many factors that's shaping the complexity of our experience and the way that we live our lives, that maybe we haven't appreciated until, in the last few years, like Thomas is saying, maybe thinking of it more in that way leads us somewhere very else. And hopefully, I would think better.
But maybe, and actually, to be honest, you reminded me of one point, which is generally in biology, in ecology, we know that diversity is good, right? If you remember, in the old days, we had these monoculture farms, everyone grew the same thing. And then this revelation came that if you grow the same thing, it's very easy for pathogens to come in and cause trouble. So these days, we like to grow farms that are very diverse, right? It's the same with microbes. Because different microbes have different powers, if you put it that way, what you normally want is a very diverse range of microbes inside you and being exposed to you so you can leverage on all the many, many powers, right? And this is super interesting given the fermentation revolution, because what people like Josh do, and of course many, many people these days, is look at ferments. And what are ferments? They're big soups of microbes. So when people go around talking about sourdoughs and kimchi and all this stuff, it's very tempting to sit back and go, that's a load of hippie rubbish, right? But what you're doing is you're bombing your body with a diverse range of microbes, right? And just by having that diverse range of microbes inside you means that you have the potential to produce a diverse range of chemicals that could potentially affect you in a different way, right? So actually, I would argue the science is pointing the fact that fermentation is actually super, super good, and it's a super good way to supplement your diet if you are taking in the ferments. And I guess you can elaborate on this, because was it not that originally we believed it was a bacteria, but maybe it's more than that?
Which?
With the fermentation, you were telling me just the other day that you don't even have to take in the actual living microbes sometimes.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was just thinking about listening to you share this. Is so something that I'm working on, and many of my colleagues also, we're starting to realize that it's not just as Tom is saying, that we get a lot of these microbes sort of involved in our bodies by eating them, but even just in the practice of making a lot of these fermented foods, by having them come into contact with our hands, for example, or our skin, that there's also this kind of exchange between our bodies and the foods, also both ways. So, and that's why I called you Rob, because one of our colleagues, Rob Dunn, has, as one of many interesting studies coming out, has shown that this sort of bidirectional exchange is happening with professional bakers, for example. So, and maybe if any of you at home also bake frequently with sourdoughs and you're feeding it and you're touching it with your hands, this effect might also be happening for you, such that what they found in this study, by bringing together, I think it was 18 professional bakers from 14 different countries in the world, bringing them in one place with their starters, and they found, among other things, that microbiome on each individual baker's hands was more similar to the microbiome of their own personal sourdough starter than their hands were to other people's hands. That's actually really remarkable. It's really remarkable. It's suggesting that, again, if we're talking about relationships and interdependence, there's a lot closer connection between each of those people and their starter than there is within our own species. I mean, this is actually quite mind-blowing, not only scientifically, but in a really profound philosophical sense. Then we start to have to ask, okay,
your sourdough is part of you.
Yeah, really, in some true way. And that's one way that we can understand fermentation that Rob and others have been proposing, is it's not just something outside of us, but we can start to think of fermentation as a kind of, what does he call it, an extended microbiome. So if we have our internal microbiome, which is like in our gut, and our external microbiome, which is maybe on our skin, then we can also think of extended microbiomes. So microbiomes that make sense scientifically to think of as part of our bodies, it just so happens that they are extended in space and time, like sourdough starters or kimchi or whatever.
In regards to humans, like two vegans falling in love or whatever else might happen in the department of attraction, or maybe also the wolf puppies moving in with the humans, how do we exchange the microbiome? Is it by licking each other's faces, or I mean, does it require, or sharing food? Does it require skin contact, or is it airborne, or what happens?
The closer you are, the easier it is, and I mean, but absolutely. I mean, dogs lick humans all day. People kiss. Kissing is a very good way to share microbes, right? So, and actually, there's some really fascinating data that if you take owners and their dogs, and you compare the microbes that live in the mouths of them, you can literally match which dog to which owner because they have shared microbes, right? And if you think about what your dog spends a lot of its day doing, what it's licking its bum, it's very unpleasant, but you absolutely see this relationship. And then the funny thing is, why does your dog love it? Why does the dog love its owner so much? Could that simply be because of these shared microbes that are being passed? Could it be a signal, right? So again, I once heard a story of a data set that was really interesting. It was a French team was studying how microbes in family groups relate, right? And so they had volunteers, and they were actually mainly drawn from their research institute, and they would sequence the two adults in the couple and the kids. And generally, you can tell family groups by shared microbes, very similar microbes in the mouth and of the kids and the parents and the dogs if they're there. The funny part of the story was they said occasionally they could see some other things. For example, Mr. in family A and Mrs. in family B had very, very shared microbes. And it always correlated with information they knew about what was going on in the background, right? And they would similarly have Mr. and Mrs. A have completely different microbes, right? Clearly it was a sign that they literally had nothing to do with each other anymore. So you do share them by the contacts, plus it's reinforced by the environment. If you're in a family group, you're eating the same food and so on, right? But again, it becomes very interesting, not just that we're sharing them, but how is that affecting, if at all, the way we interact with each other, right? Is it people in a real loving relationship, right? Are they extra loving because they're sharing microbes and they're affecting the brain and drawing some kind of recognition or not? This is where one can start to really speculate what's going on. And animal evidence suggests it could be true.
Maybe that's actually a good place to come to rye bread, which I know that you maybe wanted to talk about, and maybe some other people want to hear about.
As foreigners, we're fascinated by rye bread.
I love rye bread, personally.
But rye bread is a good example because what I have said is that fiber is good for you because fiber, the bacteria convert to short-chain fatty acids, and then in general, there is nothing more fibrous, as far as I can tell, than rye bread. It's even more fibrous than cardboard, from what I can tell. Right? So in theory, eating it should be a great thing, right? But the funny thing is, Denmark loves its rye bread. Most of the rest of the world doesn't understand rye bread, right? Now, the question is, why do we in the rest of the world not understand it? And there's a very simple reason that not all Danes know, especially not Danes that haven't been out hiding, which is when most people who don't live in Denmark get given rye bread, they spend the next 6 hours farting. It's very simple. You produce huge amounts of flatulence, right? And so the thing is, I can remember, like when I came to Denmark, my wife was eating rye bread. I ate rye bread. I had a very uncomfortable rest of the day. And I'm like, what the hell's going on with my wife? Does she have like an iron sphincter and is keeping it in? But did you ask her? Or? Still not got there after many years. Yeah. But it's a very interesting thing because the answer to this is that actually, if you're not used to eating rye bread, you actually produce lots of flatulence, right? And if you are used to eating it, you don't. And the reason is because food shapes the microbes, and it's a kind of slow process, right? So what happens is if you grow up eating rye bread, and you take rye bread in every day, you've got the right microbes inside you that are perfectly adapted to digesting rye bread and making you calm and so on and so on. But if I come in from abroad, I'm not used to eating it, I've got the wrong microbes inside me, taken in the rye bread, it reacts badly. It's like putting petrol in a diesel car, right? It's just the wrong things going on there. And so actually, because those who don't eat rye bread don't have the right microbes, they can't understand what's going on here, right? If, on the other hand, you move here, you slowly change your diet, you can basically benefit from doing that, right? So it is a very interesting thing because you can start to ask the question, like, maybe this thing that all these non-Danes find insane could actually be a wonder solution for the rest of the world. Maybe you could be exporting rye bread around the world if you can get people over that initial bump, right? So the way to do that would be to slowly change the amount of rye bread in the diet, slowly increase it, slowly change the microbes. You'd have the whole world living off rye bread. We'd be a happier place.
So maybe this is the secret, actually, to
I
why
think that
Denmark is the happiest country
This
on
is the
Earth.
secret to why Denmark's the happiest
Yes,
country in
rye
the world.
bread.
It could be
You've
Denmark's contribution to the world, right? So there is great potential in the rye bread, right, if foreigners can get over eating it. But it's a fascinating thing. And I say, it's very weird. You kind of cross the border, go to Sweden, Germany, people stop because they can't tolerate it, and that's why.
Maybe we're going to end on that note in the interest of time. But I wanted to thank you very much for the conversation, Tom, and maybe we can all thank Tom for sharing with us his knowledge today.
Du har lyttet til Verden forsøgt forklaret. En udsendelse fra Københavns Universitet, udviklet med støtte fra Novo Nordisk Fonden.